Yeah, it really is. And because this material is already operating at such a high intellectual level, we're just going to skip the basics and dive straight into the high-level structural and thematic critiques to, maximize the impact of your argument.
I am really looking forward to getting into the weeds on this one because, the foundation is incredibly robust, but the execution, it just needs a sharper edge to really deliver on that premise.
Right, exactly. So let's just jump right in. A tighter differentiation between cynical political maneuvering and genuine ideological radicalization will significantly elevate the core argument.
Yeah, that is the big one.
Because right now, the script kind of oscillates between two slightly conflicting threat models,
Right. It can't quite make up its mind.
Exactly. On one hand, you have the text arguing that the subject is basically this cynical opportunist, like he's merely chasing foreign bot engagement, he's following these digital algorithmic tides. There's even that comparison to Piers Morgan.
Which is a great comparison.
It is. But it characterizes him as this sort of harmless opportunist who's just, going wherever the attention is. But then, a few pages later, the script drops the 1932 Franz von Papen analogy.
Yeah, that was a shit.
It compares the whole situation to the empowerment of world-destroying true believers. And that just muddles the narrative for me. Is the subject a harmless opportunist being tricked, or the architect of something way darker?
Right, it is a massive tonal collision, and the reader is left sitting there thinking, wait, which is it?
Right. I struggled with the von Papen analogy specifically because of this. It feels borderline hyperbolic to compare a modern digital politician who's basically farming for Twitter likes to a 1930s aristocrat who enabled a historical catastrophe.
Right. The stakes feel wildly different.
Exactly. So my question is, does the script currently confuse the enabler with the radical?
Well, that is the exact tension we need to resolve. And I actually think you decisively link these two ideas by showing how cynical expediency is the exact mechanism that empowers true extremists, rather than treating them as separate phenomena.
Oh, interesting. So you don't drop the analogy, you lean into it?
You lean all the way in. The weakness here is presenting an either-or scenario to the audience. You don't need to soften the analogy, you just need to aim it better. You reframe the Franz von Papen historical analogy to directly serve the cynicism thesis.
Okay, break that down for me. How does the author do that?
So, make it explicitly clear that von Papen wasn't necessarily a radical Nazi himself. He was a wealthy aristocrat, he was a cynic, who looked at this vulgar radical youth movement and thought, I can harness that energy for my own political gain.
Ah, okay. He thought he was riding the tiger, but he didn't realize he was the meat.
Exactly. That is the exact framing this critique needs. He thought he was playing this detached game of political leverage, and because of his cynicism, he handed the keys to the kingdom to true extremists. And that is exactly like the critique being leveled at the subject.
I see. So by drawing that highly specific parallel, the author harmonizes the he's just doing it for engagement theory with the this is incredibly dangerous conclusion.
Precisely. You don't have to choose between the two. You say, no, the cynicism is what makes the danger possible.
Yeah, that bridges the gap perfectly. So for a concrete example, the author could write something like, the danger isn't that he's become a true believer. The danger is that catastrophes are unlocked by cynics who think they can weaponize a mob they don't actually agree with.
That is exactly the rhetorical pivot. You take the modern digital reality, the foreign bots, the algorithmic pandering, and you tie it directly to von Papen's fatal miscalculation. You show the audience that farming for Twitter likes in a polarized era has the exact same structural outcome as those 1930s backroom deals.
Right. Intent doesn't matter when the architecture of the coalition is handed over to malign forces.
Exactly. And doing that, well, it fundamentally changes the burden of proof for the rest of the essay.
It really does. Which brings us perfectly to the next major point. Rooting the behavioral analysis in direct, specific evidence of the subject's own rhetoric rather than proxy associations will make the critique much more bulletproof.
Yes, we have to look at the evidence being used to convict the subject in the text.
Right. Because having clarified the motive, the cynicism acting as an enabler, we now need to see the proof. And honestly, looking at the middle section of this script, the prosecution's case feels incredibly circumstantial.
It really does. It's leaning heavily on proxy associations.
Yeah. I mean, think about it like building a legal case. If you're building a legal case, is silence enough of a smoking gun compared to active speech?
Usually not.
Right. But the glaring weakness here is that the argument leans heavily on the subject's subject's silence. The text spends all these paragraphs focusing on his failure to condemn Tucker Carlson's alleged anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And it zeroes in on his silence when Candace Owens attacks Erica Kirk. And then it relies heavily on third-party anecdotes from Rod Dreher.
Right. The whole timeline of him being ghosted.
Exactly. Indicting a highly visible political figure, primarily through guilt by omission or through the hurt feelings of a former friend, it just leaves the argument so vulnerable to easy dismissal. Critics will just look at this and say, well, he can't police his friends.
Right. They'll say he's a busy guy. He can't issue a press release every time someone he knows says something controversial on a podcast. And frankly, they'd have a point, right?
Exactly. A skeptic reads this and says, so what? A politician is shifting his coalition over a 2-year period. He's ignoring some text messages. That's just normal politics.
Right. So we have to dismantle the he's just adapting defense. We need to anchor the critique in the subject's active choices, direct statements, and tangible policy shifts to prove the shifting values hypothesis.
I love that. So you cannot use passive silence to prove an active threat.
Exact. You systematically replace the arguments based on silence with his actual words.
The material briefly mentions a recent Joe Rogan appearance, right?
Yeah, just in passing.
That is a massive missed opportunity for concrete evidence. It's mentioned as a sort of nod and a wink to certain stereotypes, but the author needs to hit the brakes there and expand massively.
Oh, absolutely. Do not gloss over a 3-hour unscripted interview.
Right. Pull the transcript. Detail exactly what was said about foreign policy and how it specifically pandered to the alt-right audience in question.
So for a concrete example, instead of just saying he was silent on Candace Owens, you explicitly contrast a previous strong stance he held with a recent active pivot.
Yes.
You write a paragraph that says, in 2021, the subject explicitly championed X, but seated across from Joe Rogan in 2024, he offered a strategic pivot, actively stating why.
That is the rhetorical structure you need. You show the reader the deliberate vocabulary swift. If you pin a change in his stated values directly to his own active quotes, you have your smoking gun.
Yeah, that is so much stronger. You don't need to rely on the fact that he left a journalist's text message on read.
Right, the anecdotal ghosting of Rod Dreher, it's interesting, but instead of relying solely on Dreher's timeline of being ghosted, track a timeline of the subject's own public statements.
Move the direct quotes to the top of the pyramid.
Exactly. The timeline of his public statements becomes the load-bearing pillar. The ghosting thing can just be a minor footnote. It's color commentary about his personal life that echoes the public shift, but it shouldn't be the core evidence.
Okay, I think that is incredibly actionable for the author. If they make those changes, they lock down the motive and they provide undeniable, active evidence.
Right. The foundation is rock solid at that point.
But then all of that grounded, meticulous setup crashes into a brick wall at the end of the piece. Bridging the gap between the modern political analysis and the concluding theological concept of Amalek is essential for a cohesive narrative.
Yeah, the ending, that transition is rough.
It's severe whiplash. Reading the end of this piece feels a bit like watching a tense political thriller. Like, we're talking about Twitter algorithms and Capitol Hill, and then suddenly it turns into a supernatural documentary in the last 10 minutes.
It really does. The transition from a grounded discussion of Gen Z psychology and political coalitions into an ancient, metaphysical discussion about a spiritual virus is incredibly jarring.
Yeah, and the promotion for the Amalek documentary, it feels a pen lib to the end of a political essay.
Right, it feels like a commercial break. It doesn't serve as the inevitable thematic culmination of the entire piece, which is what it should.
Exactly. So how can the writer better prepare the audience for that massive genre shift? Because right now, the audience hasn't been given the vocabulary to process it.
Well, the suggestion is to weave the metaphysical and moral themes into the political critique much earlier in the script. You use the concept of moral relativism as a staircase down into the theological conclusion.
A staircase down. I like that.
Yeah, you have to walk the reader gently from the shallow waters of Twitter engagement down into the deep, dark theology. You can't just drop a 3,000-year-old biblical concept onto a modern behavioral analysis without laying the philosophical groundwork first.
Okay, so let's brainstorm some concrete examples of how the author can lay those bricks earlier on.
Well, when discussing the darker parts of inner psychology that drive cynical politics earlier in the script, explicitly plant a thematic flag.
Oh, right. When they're talking about the algorithmic tides and the Piers Morgan behavior?
Exact. Use a transitional thought there. You could say something like, when leaders abandon good faith for algorithmic expediency, they open the door to something ancient. It's not just bad politics, it's a moral void that history has a name for.
Oh, I see. So you don't say the word Amalek yet?
No.
You just introduce the concept of the void.
Precisely. You are priming the audience's ear for a metaphysical frequency. The text is already argued that whenever values are governed purely by digital expediency, humanity is led in a dangerous direction.
Right.
So if you expand on that specific thread, highlighting how cynicism actively rots the foundation of truth, then the eventual introduction of Amalek makes total sense.
Because Amalek is the ultimate historical manifestation of the cynicism we just spent 10 pages dissecting.
Exactly. It's the force that whispers, morality isn't worth it, nothing is sacred, just get the engagement. And when you frame it that way, the documentary promo stops feeling like a tacked-on advertisement.
It feels like the ultimate payoff.
Right. The reader hits that final paragraph and goes, of course. This ancient concept perfectly articulates the modern crisis we just analyzed.
Yeah, but that only works if the author builds that staircase early on.
Exactly. You have to define the symptoms before you reveal the name of the virus.
I love that framing. Well, I think we have covered a lot of really dense, high-level ground today. Let me concisely summarize the 3 main actionable takeaways for this critique.
Go for it.
That is a perfect summary. And I have to say, I am genuinely excited about the potential of this piece. The raw material here is just incredibly potent, and the historical connections are really sharp. I warmly invite the listener to implement these structural changes, rethink how the evidence is layered, and submit your revised work back in for another critique. I would absolutely love to see how this evolves. Definitely. A strong piece of writing doesn't just present interesting fact, it forces the audience to rethink the underlying mechanics of the world. And by tightening the motive, activating the evidence, and smoothing out that thematic descent into the conclusion, this script has the potential to do exactly that. Keep digging into those complexities, and we will see you on the next critique.